But I want to pick up with Elijah. We looked at verse 1 last night. Verse 1, now God may have had other assignments for Elijah. We don't know that. It's not recorded. The first assignment that we know of, God basically gave him an impossible assignment. Maybe you can identify with that. Assignment that seemed hopeless, seemed impossible, which God delights in. In fact, sometimes people have told me, they said, well, I'm not sure if this is of God because it just seems impossible. I'd say, well, it sounds exactly like God. He delights in asking you to do things that are impossible in your own strength. If you could do it in your own strength, you won't see God. And so God tells Elijah to do something very difficult. Go and tell a very evil person. And you have to understand the culture in which Elijah is ministering. It's become very secular, it's become very ungodly. In fact, at one point, he mistakenly even complains, I'm the only one left. I just feel like I'm all alone. I just feel like I'm in a sea of worldliness and ungodliness. The government leaders are pushing all kinds of immorality and false beliefs on society, and I'm trying to turn God's people and the nation back. Which, by the way, how many churches or individuals does God need before he can impact an entire nation? One. Don't ever lose your belief that one church can impact an entire nation. One church is all it takes of God, when it's rightly responding to him. And in Elijah's case, one minister, one person. How big is the God that you serve? Don't tell me. See, sometimes we say by what we believe, well, my doctrine says God's all powerful. Well, no, based on how you're leading, how powerful does your God appear to be to everyone who... Well, see, that one thing people said about my dad all the time is he's leading as if he's got a huge church. He's leading as if he's got a huge staff or he's got a huge budget. He doesn't have any of that. And my dad would say, no, I don't have any of that, but I've got a huge God. And if you serve a big God, you got to think big, do you not? And when you start thinking small, it means you're starting to view God as small. So here's Elijah. God says, go to the most evil leader ever and tell him news that's going to make him want to kill you. And what does Elijah do? He gets up and he delivers it, just nails it. And then we saw, now there's two words that in this chapter are very important. And what I love to do, and this is why I love teaching some of this kind of stuff to leaders like you who lead Bible studies and preach and teach, is, when you read a passage that you're familiar with, there's a problem with that. Like, I love marking up Bibles and taking notes and highlighting verses, and I think it's great to do. But there's a problem with that. Because when you come back and you read a passage that you've worked over and studied before, what is it that your eyes are immediately drawn toward? What you saw before, right? What you underlined. Immediately I read the notes. Oh yeah, I remember when I did this last time. That was really a great truth. And oh yeah, that word is a key word. I did a study on that last time. And what you do is you keep going back and seeing what you've already seen. And one of the dangers when you've been in ministry a while is you don't want to keep seeing the same stuff you've always seen. You want to say, God, give me fresh eyes to see what I've not yet seen. Sometimes that means getting a different Bible. I just wore out a Bible not too long ago, and it was tough. I was preaching in front of it was an 8,000 seat auditorium, and I'm preaching, and the entire section of Genesis fell out of my Bible. I'm in front of this huge crowd, and I was like, oh, it's Genesis. And that's what I was preaching out. I thought, okay, time to get another Bible. And so all of a sudden you got this Bible with all these virgin, clean pages, unmarked. But it's rich. When you start seeing, I never saw that before. Never saw that before. And so sometimes, and I'm not talking about making stuff up, Some people are really super spiritual because they see stuff that's not even there. But I'm talking about seeing it's there. I never saw that before. And so sometimes, my dad called this a sanctified imagination, which doesn't mean you're making it up. It just means you're asking new questions you hadn't asked before, and it opens up insights and windows into the and it just gives you a fresh vision. I love that. I love just seeing, because how much stuff can you find in one chapter in the Bible? There's just layer upon layer of truth, is there not? Isn't it rich when you have, sometimes in ministry I know you're just trying to get that next Bible study or sermon together, but I love it when I can just carve out some time to say, I just want to soak here for a little bit. Because I think there's a lot more here than I've been gleaning before. So anyway, that's what I've tried to do in this passage. And so there's some words that I think are important to notice. And so here's one of the words, the word then. Verse 2 starts off, it says, then the word of the Lord came to him. Now, then, I don't know if you ever preached a sermon on the word then before, but the word then signifies timing, right? Remember I said last night, you need to be an expert in the ways of God. God's ways are not your ways, so you've got to learn the ways of God. You've got to be an expert in the ways of God, because if you don't know how God does things, you're going to keep missing Him. He's going to be working in your church, but you're not going to recognize it because you don't recognize, oh, only God would do that. Or you're going to try to help somebody, but you're going to help them in your strength instead of the way God would help somebody. And so you've got to know the ways of God. And so whenever you see the word then, it signifies timing. Remember last night I said it's not just what God does that matters, it's when He does it. Because God could choose any time to act, so you have to always ask yourself, so why did He act then? Why didn't He act sooner? Why didn't He act later? Why at this point? And so this is what's happened. God told Elijah, go preach a sermon that's probably going to get you killed. And so he does it. And then as soon as he finishes that sermon, it says, then God spoke to him. And He said, leave here, turn eastward, and hide at the Wadi Cherith, where it enters the Jordan. You are to drink from the water. I have commanded the ravens to provide for you there. So basically, when Elijah goes to preach the sermon, he doesn't know how it's going to turn out, right? And he preaches, and then God tells him what to do next. And what does God tell him to do? Run for your life. They're going to kill you. And so he runs. Now, there's a lot of stuff that's interesting there, but one thing is, like when God told him to preach the sermon, why didn't God just say, and Elijah, as soon as that sermon's done, run for your life? Like, why does He wait? Why does He not tell him to run until after the sermon?
Just be afraid.
Yeah, he might have not. That might, sometimes it's just better not to know how things are going to happen. Because if we knew the kind of trouble obedience would get us into, we might be discouraged to do it. That's right. Also, if he hadn't obeyed, he wouldn't need that instruction, would he? If he hadn't obeyed, then he wouldn't need that word. He would have needed a different word. When does God speak to Elijah and give him the next word? Immediately after he's obeyed the previous word. Now, I've had people say, God seems to have gone silent with me. God used to speak to me. I used to get a fresh word from God. Heaven's kind of gone silent. Now, there's lots of reasons why that happens. There's not just one reason. But whenever someone tells me that, I just feel like heaven's kind of gone silent on me lately. The first thing I usually ask is, well, what is the last thing you know God did tell you to do? Because if you haven't obeyed the last word He gave you, there may be no reason to give you the next word. When does God speak to Elijah and give him the instruction? Immediately after he obeys the previous instruction. So I tell people, the first thing you ought to do, take an inventory of everything you already know God has told you to do, and have you checked every box to say, obeyed, obeyed, obeyed. And if all those boxes are checked, you're in a perfect position to receive a new word from God. So God speaks to him, and what does He say? He says, run. Go to the wilderness. Which also tells me something that I think is very important for ministry. Not every day is a day to fight. Now, that's why we're not sure if Elijah was a Baptist, because Baptists kind of feel like every day is a good day to fight. There are some Baptist leaders who feel like if you're not fighting, you must be doing something wrong, And I hear crazy stuff like, how many times have you heard people say, well, he must be doing something right. He's got a lot of people mad at him, Well, or he could be a jerk, That could be the other reason. It's like, don't assume because people are mad at you, it must be like you're doing something right. Could be you're doing something terribly wrong. But I've seen some ministries come to an early demise because they fought on a day, if they checked with God, God would have said, get to the wilderness, withdraw. Now, the interesting thing is that later in Elijah's life, a different king is going to send 50 soldiers to arrest him. And what is Elijah going to do then? He's going to call fire down and obliterate all 50, right? And so the king sends another 50. Elijah calls fire down, obliterates them. Elijah doesn't run. Elijah just holds his ground and just roasts 100 soldiers. And then that king, who obviously doesn't care much about a soldier, sends 50 more soldiers. And at that point, the 50 soldiers are going to get on their knees and beg Elijah not to kill them too. Now that's the very same God, the very same prophet in this passage. So it's clear if God wanted to, he could say, hey, just tell Ahab, give me your best shot. Let me see what I'll send fire down on you too. God could have done that, right? But on this day, God says, withdraw. Don't charge into a fight until you're sure God told you to enter that fight. On some days, God may say, this isn't the day for that. Watch the timing and the ways of God. Here's Elijah, the fire-falling prophet of God, and God says, today I want you to run, retreat, withdraw. This is not the day to enter into battle. So he goes into the wilderness. And when I said last night, I've seen many ministers who had a successful ministry, had a growing church, had people who really appreciated them, and the next thing they know, they find themselves in a wilderness. And I've seen some really godly people beating themselves up, saying, where did I go wrong? I must have sinned. God must not be pleased with me. Something must be wrong for me to be in this wilderness. Because when we think of a wilderness, we typically think of it as a bad place, don't we? Think about the Israelites, the most famous wilderness wanderers. They spent 40 years in the wilderness. Why were they in the wilderness? Disobedience, yeah. Nothing will get you in the wilderness faster than disobedience. Because they wouldn't trust God to go into a promised land. God said, then your consequence will be you'll waste your life in a wilderness. 40 years aimlessly wasting their life in a wilderness. Dry, desolate, parched wilderness. So when we think of the wilderness, we tend to think, well, that's when you get there, it's because God's punishing you. But in this case, he's not being punished, is he? He's been perfectly obedient. Hasn't done a thing wrong. He still ends up in a wilderness. By the way, are there any examples in the Bible of someone else who was perfectly obedient and ended up in a wilderness? Jesus, yeah. He's baptized, even though he doesn't need to be. He's perfectly righteous. Has no sin to be baptized for, but he's baptized anyway just to fulfill all righteousness. And his Father in heaven is so pleased with him that his Father actually breaks the heavenly silence and says, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Now, if God was so pleased with you that he couldn't help himself, he had to just speak out loud so everybody around you would know how proud he was of you, what would you expect God's next work in your life to include? Like blessing, right? Like what we think is, this is the way it works with us and God. We obey and God blesses. That's how it works, right? I obey, God blesses. That's the deal. That's the relationship. So it's very confusing to us when we obey and instead of what seems like a blessing, we end up in a wilderness. We get criticized. We get attacked. We get second-guessed. We get financial issues that strike us. And that's one of the most confusing things for ministers. And I hear people say, we left our family, we left our home, we came all the way here to minister in this church. We're in a foreign country, and we've done all this for God, and then our child fell apart. Our child is doing drugs. Our financial support got cut. And where's God? Why would God let this happen to me? If you haven't been there, you will be. Where you do what you felt like God wanted you to do and things got worse. Jesus makes his Father so pleased with him that his Father speaks out loud. And what's the next thing his Father does? The Spirit of God drives him into a wilderness. By the way, is there anything about a wilderness? Well, I guess what that tells me is this. There are some things that God does best in a wilderness. There's some work God will do in your life that he does best there, as opposed to in the thoroughfare of ministry sometimes. What is it about a wilderness that actually could be really conducive
there's no distraction.
No distractions, yeah. You know, how many of you have thought, you know, there's all these things I know I need to work on. I'd love to study this. I'd love to read that. I really need to meditate on this. As soon as things slow down, as soon as the phone stops ringing, as soon as I don't have meetings all day, sometimes a wilderness, those are all removed, aren't they? What else about a wilderness might be helpful in what God was trying to work into your life? Preparation. Yeah, because have you ever felt like, I tell you, sometimes when ministry just gets crazy, I feel like I'm just always unprepared. I'm just throwing a sermon together, just, you know, skimming the notes of a meeting before going in, and it's like, oh, I just feel like so many times I'm just half loaded here and I'm not prepared. And so sometimes God just says, let me just pull you aside and just let you put some things in your life that really need to be there before the next thing. Now in Elijah's case, by the way, silence. I mean, just, you know, there are some ministers who don't know what to do with silence. Like I know people that you'd have to have like a medical intervention if you took their cell phone away from them, because they'd like start going through withdrawals and all kinds of fits because they wouldn't know what to do with themselves. I remember one time I had a young pastor ask me to mentor him, and he came to my office, sat down, but his phone just kept buzzing him, and he just had to see what was coming. I finally just stopped and said, look, it's your phone or me, but you're wasting my time right now. I'm willing to give you my time. I'm not willing to let you waste my time. So turn that thing off and listen to me, or go and have a relationship with that phone that seems really important to you. But you know what? And I'll tell you what, it's really hard for me. Have you ever tried to have a quiet time when you're in front of your computer? Like, then every signal that comes in, it's just constant interruptions, constant input. I'll tell you what, whether it's a wilderness or just time alone, every minister needs time where they have silence with God. Just me and God. And I have people say, well, I love having my quiet times at the coffee shop. Well, good for you, but you're going to miss out on some things you only get when it's just, the only sound you hear is the voice of God. Every other sound is turned off. And you just say, I really need to hear from God right now. Elijah is being prepared for Mount Carmel, where he will in one day impact an entire nation, but God is preparing him. And so he says, I'm going to send you to a wilderness. So he goes to this desolate place. By the way, you know, it's interesting to me because Elijah is the greatest preacher of his day, right? He preaches and weather patterns change. He preaches and he humbles the most powerful government leader in the land. So if you were God and you want to bring revival to a nation, and you've got a preacher the caliber of Elijah, where do you think you'd put Elijah? Where would you assign him? Biggest, yeah, you'd put him in the biggest temple. You'd put him at least on Main Street or outside the Capitol, in the business district to impact influencers. But I mean, by the way, that's one of the reasons you have to be careful about things like strength finders. Because what so many ministers do is they take a test to find out what they're good at, and then they assume that God is going to call them to do what they're strong at, what they're good at. If Elijah had taken a strength finder right after this sermon, it would have, speaking prophetic words would have been right off the charts, right? And if he based his calling and assignment based on his strengths, he would never have gone to a church of 0 people, would he? Is it possible to faithfully lead a church and to grow that church and strengthen that church, and then God's next assignment to be in a place that's smaller? That's harder? That where they're not responsive to your preaching like the former church was? Elijah preaches the greatest sermon of the day. His next assignment is a congregation of ravens, of no people. That seems like a waste. It seems like a waste. Like, God, you're mismanaging. Like, God, if I had an Elijah in my arsenal, I'd have him out there every day just to the biggest crowds possible, because I'm trying to bring revival to the land. God's trying to revive a nation. He sends his best preacher to a wilderness where there's no people. Doesn't make sense to me, right? And what you're going to find in this whole account is that God's ways are not our ways. One thing you'll get from this chapter is, if I were God, I would never have treated Elijah the way God did. And that's because I don't think the way God. By the way, that's why God confuses us. Oftentimes people say, I'm just confused by why God would do this in my life. Well, the only reason you're confused is because you don't understand the ways of God. If you knew the way God functions, it would make perfect sense to you. But the reason we're confused is we don't understand how God acts. So God says, go to the wilderness. It's so desolate that you can't even get food for yourself. I'm going to have to airlift in food twice a day for you. Because, and by the way, here's one of those questions. Why twice a day? Remember, because sometimes you read this and you just read it and you move on, right? But ask yourself, when the Israelites were in the wilderness, how many times did he send food for them? Once a day, right? Every morning. Now, why does God have to send shipments twice a day? Like, is he kind of short on ravens at the time? Was he having to kind of double up? And like if I were God, I would have just sent a huge flock of ravens in the morning. They would have just delivered this really nice buffet, and all day long. I mean, it's like it's your number one servant, right? So you want to treat him well. So why wouldn't you just put this nice buffet there for Elijah? So anytime he was hungry, he'd just go get from a pile of food all those ravens brought. Why does he bring it in twice a day?
To make sure he relies on God.
Okay. I mean, because now, if it came in once a day, wouldn't you be relying on God too? Why?
Not enough food once a day.
Spoil.
Could spoil. Now, the manna lasted a day, and it was pretty flimsy, right?
More frequent reminders of God's presence.
Yeah, so I think that's great. What's the difference between the Israelite experience in the wilderness and Elijah's experience? God had a different purpose for those two wilderness encounters, didn't he? What was God trying to accomplish with the Israelites? Yeah, and they were done, right? Like they had no future. It didn't matter what they did, they were not going to enter the promised land. So the Israelites were just existing, right? Once a day, just keep them fed till they die. Like that's it. I mean, literally, there's no future for them. I don't care what they learn, I don't care what they change, they're never going in. So let's just send their food, let them eat it until they die, literally. But what's God trying to do with Elijah?
We want him to leave.
He's trying to teach him something, isn't he? And what he's teaching him is, you can count on me. You can count on me. Twice a day, like clockwork, when you need that next provision, it'll be right on time. Now, why is that going to be important for Elijah? Because in the next chapter, he's going to be standing in front of a bunch of bloodthirsty, idol supporters who want to kill him. And he's going to ask for something he's never asked for before. God, would you provide fire from heaven right now? Not tomorrow. If you provide it tomorrow, I'm dead. I need it right now. And how can Elijah be so confident that when he asks God for something, it's going to come right when he needs it? How can he be so certain of that? Literally put his life on the line for that. Well, because that whole time in the wilderness, over and over and over again, God said, you needed it, here it is. You needed it, here it is. And God's trying to teach him something in the wilderness that he's going to desperately need to be confident of when he's back in the battle. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that if that's all you're doing all day long, twice a day, watching for when the ravens come in, what do you become an expert at? You become an expert at recognizing what's on the horizon, right? You think, well, it's about time. Oh, yeah, sure enough, I can see them. Way, way off in the distance. Those are ravens. Now, he might have at first thought, oh, no, maybe that's a cloud. Maybe that's smoke. Maybe that's something else. But after a while, he becomes an expert at recognizing God's provision on its way. Now, why is that going to be important to Elijah later? The next chapter, remember he prays for rain? And his servant goes and looks and comes back and says, no rain coming, just this little cloud the size of a man's hand. And what does Elijah say? It's on the way. How does Elijah know what that symbolizes? Well, because in those desolate, lonely wilderness wanderings, he learned to recognize God's provision when it was still far away. And now he recognized the hand of God anywhere. All kinds of lessons. Don't ever think, if you're in kind of a wilderness time right now, don't ever think that God's wasting his time with you or wasting your life. Even in the bleakest moments of your life, God's building stuff in, because He's preparing you for something still to come. And there's some lessons you can only learn in the wilderness, so embrace that wilderness and just trust God. There's a purpose even for this. You might be in between jobs. You might feel like what you're doing is coming to a close. And you might wonder, God, do you have anything left for me? And God would say, just wait. Everything that I'm allowing in your life right now, every bit of it is going to be used in your next assignment. There's a purpose for it. One other word just to point out, and then we'll stop for this morning. I told you there's two words that are really key in this whole story. One is then. You're going to see that word then show up several times, and each time it's going to be strategic. It's going to indicate the timing of God. But there's another word that's also crucial. It's the word so, S-O. Again, you probably never preached a sermon on so, but do you notice God keeps giving Elijah really difficult assignments. I mean, here's a guy who's just put his life on the line, preached the sermon of his life, and thinking, okay, now, do I get the blessing of God? Do I get the accolades of people? Instead, God says, all right, well done. Now run for your life into a desolate wilderness where you can't even find seeds or plants to eat. You've got to have your food airlifted in. And if you think of other Bible characters, they might have begun to grumble and complain and whine and argue. But you notice what it says, verse 5, it says, so he proceeded to do what the Lord commanded him. Every time you see the word, well, I shouldn't say every time, often when you see the word so, it's a hinge point. Usually God will speak, then you see the word so, and what comes, everything about the person's future ministry hinges on what comes after the word so. Now you don't always see the word so, but it's implied. It might say, so Moses began to argue with God for 2 chapters and say, you've got the wrong man. Or it might say, so the rich young ruler went away sad because he had much wealth. Or so the fishermen got out of their boats and immediately followed Jesus. So everything hinges on that 2-letter word. And what I would tell you is our lives have a series of so's in them. You're serving where you are today because of a so. One day you sense God saying, I want to move you to this place of ministry. It might have absolutely blown you away that you'd ever leave where you were and go to this place. You never imagined that you'd do that. But you clearly sense the leading of God, and there was a big so in your life. So, you got up, you left family, left home, and you followed Him. If you were to look back over your life, you'd see a series of so's where God spoke and you responded. And sometimes we take those decision points so lightly, but we look back on our life and we realize, you know what, I had no idea how huge it was when I decided to get up and go. What you're going to see with Elijah is that all through this chapter, God gives him assignments, and they get harder and harder and harder. What you're going to see in this chapter is, every time, this is what's going to happen. God's going to give Elijah a word. It's going to say, so Elijah obeyed. And then you know what's going to happen? Elijah's life's going to get harder. You're just going to see that this whole chapter. So when God says, preach a difficult sermon, what does Elijah do? He obeys. But of course he's a preacher. That's what he does. So it might be, it's a dangerous sermon, but at least that's what he does. Preaches a sermon. So what happens? He preaches a sermon, he obeys, his life gets harder. Now he's in a desolate wilderness where unless food is brought in every day miraculously, he's going to die. He was preaching in the courtroom of kings, and he does that faithfully, so God's assignment now is go to a place that doesn't even require preaching at all. And what we'll see tomorrow is he's going to be faithful in a desolate wilderness, and so what's his reward going to be? The water's going to dry up. Life's going to, every time he obeys, things get harder. And I'll tell you, that is one of the most confusing aspects of Christian ministry. If I ever have ministers who want counsel and encouragement, it is when they obey God and then things get more difficult, not less. It doesn't make sense to us. And we'll start to struggle and say, God, I must have made a mistake. I thought you wanted me to do this. But now people are upset with me. People have left the church. The finances have gone down. I must have done something wrong, because in my mind, I've just always believed that when you do what God tells you to do, things get better. But what you're going to see with the greatest prophet that God has, he's going to, every time it says so, Elijah's going to get up and obey, and the next thing that he knows, things are going to get worse. It does not make sense to us. And I'll tell you, if you want a ministry like Elijah's, you've got to be willing to be prepared the way God prepared Elijah. His ways are not our ways. And if you're in a state of maybe confusion about some things in your ministry right now, it may be you need to go before God and say, God, I don't think I understand your ways as clearly as I should. Because the way you're handling me right now does not make sense to me. Help me to understand why you're doing in my life, my church, my ministry, what you are, so I can embrace your work and thrive in it instead of being confused or discouraged by it. You might be discouraged by the very thing God is trying to do to make you a greater minister than you've ever been before. Well, let me pray with you, and I'll be done. Lord, thank you for these here this morning. And Lord, help us to understand your ways. We think we know them because we've read the Bible all of our lives. We've been in church all of our life. But you've assured us our ways are not your ways. So God, would you help us in whatever area, whatever part of our ministry right now that's confusing to us. I pray, Lord, you'll open our eyes and understanding to see your hand even in that. And for those who may be in a wilderness right now, would you help us, Lord, to trust you there. That whatever good work you can only do in a wilderness, we pray that we'll just open our lives and you'll do it thoroughly in us. Because we know that you always have a purpose for what you do. There's always something greater still to come. And I pray every one of us will see that great new work you're preparing us for right now. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.